Jerusalem has been conquered, burned, rebuilt, prayed over, cursed, divided, and desired for more than 3,000 years. Kings have entered its gates in triumph and left them in chains. Armies have climbed its hills believing that heaven itself waited behind the walls. Pilgrims have crossed deserts simply to touch its stones. Prophets gave it names of hope. Conquerors gave it names of power. Exile spoke of it as though the city were not made of limestone and dust, but of memory itself. And still, Jerusalem survived them all. Stand on the Mount of Olives before sunrise, and the city seems almost peaceful. The walls glow pale gold. The great dome at the center catches the first light. Bells begin to sound from Christian churches. The call to prayer moves across the rooftops. At the western wall, prayers have already been placed between ancient stones. Streets that will soon fill with merchants and pilgrims remain quiet for a few final moments. It is easy, in that silence, to believe that Jerusalem has always looked this way. But beneath every step is another city. Beneath the Ottoman walls are medieval streets. Beneath the medieval streets are Roman paving stones. Beneath the Roman stones lie the remains of the Second Temple Age. Beneath those are traces of a smaller hill town built around a spring. Every generation built over the last. Every ruler tried to make Jerusalem permanent. None succeeded. The city endured because it never belonged to time in the ordinary way. To understand Jerusalem, we must begin before the famous kings, before the temples, before Rome, before Christianity, and before Islam. We must begin with water. The hills of Jerusalem are not the obvious place to build a great city. There is no wide river beside them, no natural harbor, no vast plain rich with easy harvests. The land is hard. Summers are dry. The roads rise sharply through the Judean highlands. To the east, the land falls toward the Dead Sea and the wilderness. To the west, routes descend toward the Mediterranean coast. Yet one small spring made permanent settlement possible. The Gihon Spring emerged near the eastern slope of a narrow ridge south of what is now the Old City. It was not a mighty river, but in a landscape where water meant survival, it was enough. People gathered near it in the Bronze Age. Houses appeared. Walls followed. The settlement grew on a defensible ridge bordered by valleys. Long before Jerusalem became holy, it was practical. Archaeology shows human occupation in the area thousands of years ago, while the first fortified town developed during the Bronze Age. By the second millennium before the Common Era, the city was part of the world of Canaan, a region of competing city-states connected by trade, diplomacy, and war. The earliest written references associated with Jerusalem emerge from this age, though the exact reading and identification of ancient names can be debated. Egyptian texts and later diplomatic letters reveal a small, but important highland city ruled by local kings who navigated the power of greater empires. One of those rulers appears in the Amarna letters of the 14th century before the Common Era. His name was Abdi-Heba, and he wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh in desperation. Enemies threatened his territory. Allies could not be trusted. He begged for soldiers and warned that the lands under Egyptian influence were slipping away. His letters do not describe a sacred capital. They describe fear. The Jerusalem of Abdi-Heba was a frontier city, vulnerable and ambitious. Its ruler addressed Egypt as a servant speaking to a distant master, but his words carried the anxiety of a man who knew that distance could be fatal. The great powers of the age shaped the region, yet local rulers still fought over ridges, roads, and villages. Already, Jerusalem stood between larger worlds. That position would define its future. Egypt lay to the southwest. Mesopotamian empires rose in the east. Coastal powers looked inland. Desert routes passed nearby. Jerusalem was never the largest city in the region, but its height, location, and defensible terrain gave it weight beyond its size. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. The Late Bronze Age order weakened. New peoples and new political identities emerged across the southern Levant. The historical record becomes a mixture of archaeology, later written traditions, and debate. This is where the story of David enters. According to the Hebrew Bible, the city was held by the Jebusites when David, king first at Hebron, sought a capital that could unite the tribes under his rule. Jerusalem stood near the border between major tribal regions. It was not yet fully identified with any one of them. Politically, it was an ideal prize. The biblical account tells of David's forces taking the stronghold and naming it the City of David. The details of the conquest remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Archaeologists continue to debate the scale of Jerusalem in the 10th century before the Common Era and the nature of David's kingdom. But the importance of the tradition is beyond doubt. Jerusalem became linked with Davidic kingship, and that connection would outlive every kingdom that followed. David brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city, transforming a political capital into a sacred center. Power and holiness began to merge on the ridge above the spring. Then came Solomon. In biblical tradition, Solomon built the first temple on the hill north of David's city. The temple became the house of the God of Israel, the place where sacrifice, kingship, memory, and covenant met. The structure itself has not survived, and direct archaeological access to the sacred platform is extremely limited. Much of what is said about it comes from ancient texts, later memory, and comparison with temples elsewhere in the region. Yet the temple's historical force does not depend on the survival of its walls. Once Jerusalem became the place of the temple, the city changed forever. A royal capital can be replaced. A sacred center is harder to abandon. After Solomon, the united monarchy described in the biblical narrative divided. The northern kingdom became Israel. The southern kingdom became Judah, ruled from Jerusalem by the line of David. The city was now capital of a smaller kingdom surrounded by danger. For generations, Jerusalem watched powers gather beyond its hills. The Assyrian Empire expanded with brutal efficiency. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Populations were deported. Kings learned to survive through tribute, diplomacy, and fear. In the late 8th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria. Refugees likely moved south. Jerusalem grew. New neighborhoods spread beyond its earlier boundaries. The city became more crowded, more important, and more exposed. King Hezekiah of Judah prepared for war. The most urgent problem was water. The Gihon Spring lay outside some defenses and could be threatened during a siege. Engineers cut a tunnel through the rock, redirecting water toward a protected pool within the expanded city. The tunnel still carries water today. An ancient inscription, discovered inside it, describes workers cutting from opposite directions until they heard one another through the stone and broke through. It is one of the most human voices to survive from ancient Jerusalem. No king speaks in that inscription. No prophet. Only workers underground, swinging tools in darkness, uncertain whether their calculations would succeed. Then, at last, the sound of another team through the rock. Above them, an empire approached. In 701 before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah. His armies devastated fortified towns, including Lachish. Assyrian records boast of trapping Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The Bible gives a different perspective, describing divine deliverance and the withdrawal of the Assyrian force. Whatever the exact sequence, Jerusalem did not fall. The city survived, but survival brought no guarantee. Assyria weakened. New powers rose. Egypt intervened. Babylon advanced from Mesopotamia. Judah's kings tried to navigate a world in which small states were crushed between empires. They failed. Babylonian forces first took Jerusalem in the early 6th century before the Common Era and carried away members of the elite. Rebellion followed. Then came the final siege. Imagine the city in its last months. Food vanishing. Disease spreading. Fires visible beyond the walls. Families waiting for a rescue that did not come. The temple still stood above them, a symbol of divine protection. Perhaps many believed Jerusalem could not truly be destroyed because the sacred house was there. That belief made what happened next almost impossible to accept. In 587 or 586 before the Common Era, Babylonian forces broke into Jerusalem. The city was burned. The palace fell. The temple was destroyed. The walls were torn down. The king of Judah, Zedekiah, fled but was captured. According to the biblical account, he was forced to watch the execution of his sons before being blinded and taken to Babylon. Jerusalem's first great age ended in flame. The destruction was more than military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. If the temple had been the house of God, how could it be gone? If Jerusalem had been chosen, how could Babylon triumph? If the dynasty of David carried a promise, why had the throne disappeared? Exile turned those questions into scripture, prayer, and identity. The people taken to Babylon carried Jerusalem with them. They remembered its streets, its temple, and its lost ceremonies. Distance made the city larger in the imagination. The physical Jerusalem lay ruined, but the remembered Jerusalem became indestructible. This was the first great lesson of the city's history. Destroying Jerusalem could make it more powerful. Decades later, the Babylonian Empire itself fell. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 before the Common Era. Persian policy allowed displaced peoples to restore local cults and communities. Groups of Judean exiles returned. Not everyone came back. Many remained in Mesopotamia, where Jewish life would continue for centuries. But enough returned to rebuild. The city they found was not the city their ancestors had lost. Ruins stood where royal buildings had been. The population was small. The land was politically subordinate to a vast empire. The returned community faced tension with people who had remained in the region and with neighboring groups whose identities and interests did not match their own. Still, the temple rose again. The Second Temple was completed around the late 6th century before the Common Era. It was smaller and less magnificent than the temple remembered in tradition, but its meaning was immense. Sacrifice resumed. Priestly authority grew. Jerusalem became the heart of a restored religious community even without an independent king. This was a new kind of power. The city no longer needed an empire of its own to matter. It could be politically weak and spiritually central. Under Persian rule, Jerusalem was rebuilt gradually. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah preserve traditions of restoring the law, rebuilding walls, organizing the population, and defining the community. These texts are religious works, not neutral chronicles, but they reveal a society struggling to recover after disaster. Memory had to become structure. Who belonged? Which laws would govern life? How should the rebuilt city relate to the empire above it and the peoples around it? Jerusalem's future depended not merely on stones, but on answers. Then, in the 4th century before the Common Era, another conqueror changed the map of the world. Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire with astonishing speed. After his death, his generals divided his conquests. Jerusalem passed between rival Hellenistic kingdoms, first under the Ptolemies of Egypt and later under the Seleucids based in Syria. Greek language and culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities adopted Greek institutions. Elites studied Greek philosophy, art, and politics. In Jerusalem, some welcomed this wider world. Others feared that it threatened the covenant and the distinct identity of the Jewish people. The conflict was not simply Jews against Greeks. It also divided Jews from one another. That division would ignite a revolt. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV intervened violently in Jerusalem's religious and political struggles. Ancient sources describe the desecration of the temple, restrictions on Jewish practice, and the installation of an alien cult. The exact motives and sequence remain debated, but the result was rebellion. A priestly family from the village of Modi'in led the resistance. They became known as the Maccabees. The revolt began in the countryside, but Jerusalem was the prize. Rebel forces eventually retook the temple and rededicated it. That rededication became the foundation of Hanukkah. What began as a revolt for religious survival became a dynasty. The Hasmoneans created an independent Jewish kingdom and made Jerusalem its capital. The city expanded. Fortifications rose. The priesthood and monarchy became entangled. Rivalries within the ruling family grew bitter. Independence brought power, but also ambition, faction, and civil war. Jerusalem had escaped one empire. It was about to invite another. In 63 before the Common Era, the Roman general Pompey entered the struggle between rival Hasmonean claimants. Rome often arrived as an ally and remained as a master. Pompey marched on Jerusalem, besieged the temple complex, and took the city. The moment carried a warning that would echo through the centuries. Jerusalem's internal divisions had opened its gates to foreign power. Pompey entered the inner sanctuary of the temple, a place forbidden to almost everyone. Roman writers remarked that he found no image of a god there. The room's emptiness must have seemed strange to a man raised among temples filled with statues. For Jerusalem, however, the violation was unmistakable. Rome now stood inside the sacred center. At first, Roman control was indirect. Local rulers remained, but their freedom narrowed. Among the men who rose through this new political order was Herod, later called Herod the Great. Herod was a brilliant builder, a ruthless survivor, and a deeply insecure king. Backed by Rome, he took Jerusalem after a siege in 37 before the Common Era. He eliminated rivals, including members of the Hasmonean family, and ruled a kingdom whose stability depended on Roman favor. He also transformed the city on a scale few rulers had attempted. Herod rebuilt the temple complex, expanding the platform with immense retaining walls and creating one of the greatest sacred precincts of the ancient world. The temple itself rose in white stone and gold. Pilgrims approaching Jerusalem would have seen it shining above the city. The project required extraordinary engineering. Hillsides were reshaped. Massive stone blocks were cut and set into place. Arches, stairways, gates, courtyards, and colonnades directed vast crowds toward the sanctuary. The Western Wall known today is part of the retaining system built around that expanded platform, not a surviving wall of the temple building itself. Herod also built a royal palace, towers, fortifications, a theater, and other monuments that announced his wealth and his connection to the wider Roman world. But stone could not make him loved. Many subjects saw Herod as too close to Rome, too foreign in his tastes, and too violent in his rule. His family became a place of suspicion and murder. He executed one of his wives and several sons. Ancient accounts, especially those of Josephus, portray a king who could command armies and architects but could not silence his own fear. Jerusalem prospered under Herod, yet the city was tense. After his death, his kingdom was divided among his heirs. Roman involvement deepened. Judea eventually came under direct Roman administration. Governors arrived from the coast. Taxes were collected. Soldiers watched the city during festivals, when large crowds and memories of liberation could turn dangerous. It was in this Jerusalem, under Roman rule and in the shadow of Herod's temple, that Jesus of Nazareth entered the final days of his life. The surviving accounts come primarily from the Christian Gospels, written by believers with theological purposes, and historians debate many details. Yet the broad setting is clear. Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims for Passover. The festival remembered deliverance from oppression. Roman officials knew the political danger of such a gathering. Jesus entered the city and drew attention. He taught in and around the temple. He challenged religious authorities. He overturned the tables of money changers in the temple precinct according to the gospel narratives. His followers believed that something decisive was about to happen. Then he was arrested. The Gospels place the Last Supper, the agony in Gethsemane, the arrest, the hearings, and the crucifixion within a compressed sequence of fear, abandonment, and public violence. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, authorized execution by crucifixion, a punishment Rome used to humiliate rebels, slaves, and those judged dangerous to imperial order. Jesus died outside or near the city walls of that time. To Rome, it may have seemed like one more execution in a restless province. To his followers, it became the center of history. They proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. The places associated with his suffering, burial, and resurrection became sacred in Christian memory. At first, the movement remained a small Jewish sect. Then it spread through the Roman world. Jerusalem became not only the city of the temple, but the city of the cross and the empty tomb. Two sacred histories now occupied the same ground. And soon, the city would be destroyed again. Roman rule in Judea became increasingly unstable. Misgovernment, economic pressure, religious tension, competing factions, and resistance created a climate in which violence could erupt quickly. In 66 of the Common Era, revolt began. The rebels achieved early victories. Roman forces were driven back. For a moment, independence seemed possible, but Rome had not yet brought its full weight to bear. The general Vespasian began the reconquest. When civil war in Rome made him emperor, command passed to his son Titus. By the year 70, Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem. The siege became one of the most terrible events in the city's history. Jerusalem was crowded with people, some of whom had arrived for Passover before the siege closed. Rebel factions fought each other even as the Romans tightened the ring. Food stores were destroyed in internal conflict. Hunger spread. Josephus, a Jewish commander who had surrendered to Rome and later wrote an account of the war, describes famine, desperation, and horror. His numbers and some dramatic details are debated, but the scale of suffering is not. The Roman legions built siege works. They battered walls. Defenders fought from towers and narrow streets. Each line of defense fell only after enormous effort. Then the Romans reached the temple. Ancient accounts differ over Titus's intentions, but the sanctuary burned. Flames consumed the structure that Herod had made magnificent. Gold melted. Smoke filled the courts. Fighting continued amid fire and falling stone. The second temple was gone. For the second time, Jerusalem's sacred center had been destroyed by an empire from Mesopotamia or beyond the eastern horizon, though this time the conqueror was Rome. The loss transformed Judaism. Sacrifice at the temple could no longer continue. Religious life increasingly centered on Torah, prayer, study, community, and the authority of rabbis. Jewish identity had already existed far beyond Jerusalem, but the destroyed city became an even more powerful symbol of exile and hope. Rome celebrated victory. Titus returned in triumph. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome, shows soldiers carrying sacred objects from the temple, including the menorah. The image was meant to display imperial power, yet it preserved, unintentionally, the memory of what Rome had tried to crush. Jerusalem itself lay devastated. The Romans stationed a legion in the area. Some parts of the city continued to be inhabited, but its old political and sacred order had ended. The temple platform remained in ruins. The city that had drawn pilgrims from across the Jewish world became a monument to defeat. Still, resistance was not finished. In the 2nd century, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, plans to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony contributed to another great rebellion. The exact causes remain debated, but the revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba erupted in 132. For a time, the rebels controlled territory and perhaps Jerusalem itself. Coins proclaimed the freedom or redemption of Israel. Bar Kokhba was hailed by some as a messianic figure. Rome responded without mercy. The rebellion was crushed by 135 after immense loss of life. Judea was devastated. Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman city with streets, temples, baths, and public buildings. A temple to Jupiter was associated with the former sacred precinct. Jews were largely barred from entering the city, though the rules and their enforcement varied over time. Even the name Jerusalem was pushed aside. But names imposed by empires do not always defeat names carried in prayer. Aelia Capitolina developed along Roman lines. A main north-south street, the Cardo, ran through the city. Columns framed shops. A forum stood near the center. The urban layout established in this period influenced later streets of the Old City. The city looked Roman. Its memory did not. For Jews, Jerusalem remained Zion, the lost center toward which prayers turned. For Christians, the city remained the landscape of Jesus' final days, even when the exact locations of sacred events were obscured beneath later construction. Then the Roman Empire itself changed. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity and granted the faith imperial favor. His mother, Helena, traveled to the Holy Land. Christian tradition credited her with identifying places connected to the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. The Roman temple associated with the site was removed. In its place, Constantine ordered the construction of a vast Christian complex. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was dedicated in the 4th century. It enclosed the sites Christians venerated as Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus. The building was not identical to the church seen today. It included a great basilica, an open courtyard, and a circular structure over the tomb. But its creation changed Jerusalem again. The city became a Christian pilgrimage center of the first rank. Pilgrims came from across the Roman world. They walked through landscapes shaped by Scripture. Churches rose on the Mount of Olives, on Mount Zion, and at other remembered sites. Monasteries filled the surrounding desert. Clergy developed ceremonies tied to the city's streets and holy places. Jerusalem was no longer merely remembered by Christians. It could be visited, touched, and seen. This physical connection to sacred history gave the city enormous power. Pilgrims carried home oil, water, soil, relics, and stories. Maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world. The earthly city became an image of the heavenly Jerusalem described in Christian scripture. Yet Christian Jerusalem was not a place of universal peace. Religious disputes divided the empire. Bishops fought over doctrine and authority. Imperial policies affected Jews, pagans, and Christian groups considered heretical. Access to the city and its sacred spaces reflected power as much as devotion. The temple platform remained largely neglected in the Christian city, in part because its ruin was interpreted as proof of Christian claims about the old order passing away. The Holy Sepulchre, not the former temple, became the architectural and spiritual center. Under Byzantine rule, Jerusalem expanded beyond the boundaries of the later Ottoman walls. The city filled with hospices, markets, monasteries, churches, and pilgrims speaking many languages. Armenian Christians established a lasting presence. Greek-speaking clergy held influence. Syriac, Georgian, Coptic, Ethiopian, and Latin Christians all came to the city. Jerusalem was becoming a world in miniature. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian added another monumental church, known as the Nea, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Its scale announced imperial wealth and Christian confidence. Aqueducts and cisterns supported the population. The Cardo extended southward. Mosaics, columns, and processions shaped the city. It may have seemed that Christian rule would last forever. But beyond the eastern frontier, Rome's ancient rival was preparing to strike. In 614, the Sasanian Persian Empire invaded the region during a devastating war with Byzantium. Persian forces, aided according to some sources by local Jewish groups hostile to Byzantine rule, captured Jerusalem after a siege. The city suffered heavily. Churches were damaged or destroyed. Many inhabitants were killed or taken captive. The relic believed to be the true cross was carried away. Accounts from the period are shaped by grief, religious polemic, and exaggeration, so exact numbers cannot be trusted. But the shock was profound. For Christians, Jerusalem had fallen to a non-Christian empire. For some Jews, Persian victory briefly opened the possibility of renewed presence and influence in the city. Those hopes did not last. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius mounted a remarkable counterattack. He defeated the Persians, recovered the lost territories, and returned the true cross to Jerusalem in 630. It was one of Byzantium's greatest triumphs. It was also almost the end of Byzantine Jerusalem. Both empires were exhausted. Years of war had drained armies, treasuries, and cities. South of their frontiers, a new religious and political force had emerged in Arabia. Within a few years, the map of the Near East would change completely. The armies of the early Islamic Caliphate moved north with astonishing speed. Byzantine forces were defeated in Syria. City after city negotiated surrender or fell. Jerusalem was isolated. Around 637 or 638, the city surrendered to Muslim rule. Later traditions describe Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entering Jerusalem in plain clothing, refusing to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre so that future Muslims would not claim the church as a mosque. The details of these stories were recorded after the event and should be treated carefully, but they express an enduring ideal: conquest restrained by responsibility toward a sacred city. The Christian patriarch Sophronius is traditionally said to have negotiated the surrender. Jerusalem's Christian population remained, its churches continued to function, and the city entered a new political world. Arabic names such as Aliyah, Beit al-Maqdis, and later Al-Quds were used for Jerusalem. The city became part of the expanding Islamic realm, ruled first by the Rashidun caliphs, and then by the Umayyad dynasty. For Muslims, Jerusalem carried deep associations. Islam honored many figures connected with the city, including Abraham, David, Solomon, and Jesus. Early Muslims had initially prayed toward Jerusalem before the direction of prayer was changed toward Mecca. Islamic tradition linked the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to the farthest mosque and his ascent through the heavens with the sacred precinct in Jerusalem. The elevated platform once occupied by the Jewish temples, neglected in much of the Byzantine period, returned to the center of the city. Under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, the Dome of the Rock was completed in 691 or 692. It was not built as an ordinary congregational mosque. It was a shrine surrounding the exposed rock at the center of the platform. The building was revolutionary. Its golden dome rose above an octagonal structure decorated with marble and mosaics. Byzantine artistic techniques were combined with a new Islamic message. Quranic inscriptions proclaimed the oneness of God and addressed Christian beliefs about Jesus. Crowns and jeweled forms appeared in mosaics without human figures, suggesting triumph over earlier empires and a sacred order larger than any dynasty. The monument did not erase the past. It gathered the past beneath a new meaning. The rock inside was already connected in Jewish and Christian tradition with the temple and with Abraham. In Islamic memory, it became associated with Muhammad's ascent and with events at the end of time. The shrine's power came partly from this layering. It stood in conversation with the city's older sacred histories, even as it made a confident statement of Islam. Nearby, the congregational mosque known as Al-Aqsa developed at the southern end of the platform. The complex was altered repeatedly after earthquakes, restorations, and dynastic change. Together, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock made the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, one of the most revered landscapes in Islam. Jerusalem had become holy in a third great monotheistic tradition. That did not make its older sacred meanings disappear. Jews continued to revere the site of the destroyed temples and sought access to the city under changing conditions. Christians continued to worship at the Holy Sepulchre and other churches. Muslim rulers governed a city whose stones carried claims no single administration could fully contain. Under Umayyad rule, Jerusalem received imperial attention. Palatial buildings were constructed south of the sacred platform. Roads and pilgrimage routes connected the city to the wider caliphate. The Umayyads ruled from Damascus, close enough for Jerusalem to hold visible importance. Then the Abbasids overthrew them in 750. The center of imperial power shifted east toward Baghdad. Jerusalem remained sacred, but it was farther from the political heart of the caliphate. Earthquakes damaged buildings. Governors changed. Local struggles affected the city. Pilgrims still came, yet Jerusalem was not always wealthy or secure. Its importance moved in cycles. At times, rulers invested in its shrines. At others, neglect and instability took their toll. Christian pilgrimage continued. Jewish communities endured, sometimes growing and sometimes shrinking. Muslim scholars wrote about the city's virtues and sacred geography. Jerusalem was no longer the capital of a kingdom. It was something more difficult to govern, a city owned by memory across borders. In the 10th century, the Fatimid dynasty took control from Egypt. Their rule brought both prosperity and crisis. Trade and pilgrimage continued, but political instability and conflict affected the region. Then came one of the most infamous moments in the history of the Holy Sepulchre. In 1009, the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the church. The reasons remain debated and must be understood within his broader, often unpredictable religious policies. The tomb shrine and much of the complex were demolished. The act shocked Christian communities far beyond Jerusalem. Later Fatimid rulers permitted reconstruction. With Byzantine support, the church was restored in a reduced form during the 11th century. Yet memory of its destruction traveled westward and became part of a growing image of endangered Christian holy places. The political map around Jerusalem was also becoming unstable. Seljuk Turkish power expanded into the region. Fatimids and Seljuks fought for control. Pilgrims faced changing conditions. Reports of hardship, whether accurate, exaggerated, or politically useful, circulated in Europe. Then, in 1095, Pope Urban II spoke at Clermont. He called on warriors of Western Christendom to aid Eastern Christians and journey to Jerusalem. His appeal drew on faith, violence, pilgrimage, penance, and the warrior culture of medieval Europe. Those who took the cross believed the expedition could cleanse sin and recover the city of Christ's passion. The First Crusade began as an idea almost too large to succeed. Thousands left their homes. Some died from hunger, disease, or battle before reaching the eastern Mediterranean. Crusader armies crossed Byzantine territory, captured cities, quarreled with allies, and endured terrible hardship. By the summer of 1099, they stood before Jerusalem. The city was then controlled by the Fatimids, who had recently retaken it from the Seljuks. Its governor prepared defenses. Wells outside the walls were affected or denied to the besiegers. The Crusaders suffered from heat and thirst. They lacked enough wood for siege engines. For men who had crossed continents expecting divine victory, Jerusalem remained behind stone. Then supplies arrived through the port of Jaffa. Timber was gathered. Siege towers were built. The Crusaders held processions around the city, praying and marching as the biblical Israelites were said to have done around Jericho. Their faith did not soften what followed. On July 15, 1099, Crusader forces broke into Jerusalem. Fighting spread through the streets and sacred precincts. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in large numbers. Medieval chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, describe massacre, though dramatic phrases about blood-reaching bridles are literary exaggerations rather than measurements. The historical truth is terrible enough without legend. A city conquered in the name of the cross became a place of slaughter. The Crusaders then prayed at the Holy Sepulchre. That contrast stands at the center of the event. Devotion beside devastation. Tears of religious triumph beside the bodies of civilians. The conquerors believed they had fulfilled a sacred mission. The conquered remembered catastrophe. History often records Jerusalem through the eyes of those who entered its gates. The dead had no chroniclers of their own. The victors established the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon declined the title of king, taking a title usually translated as defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After his death, his brother Baldwin was crowned king. A Western Christian kingdom now ruled the city. The Crusaders reshaped Jerusalem's sacred spaces. The Dome of the Rock was interpreted as the temple of the Lord and placed under Christian control. Al-Aqsa Mosque became a royal palace and later the headquarters associated with the Knights Templar, whose name came from their location on what Christians called the Temple of Solomon. The Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt and expanded into much of the form visible today. Latin clergy took leading positions, while Eastern Christian communities negotiated their place under the new order. Jerusalem became the symbolic capital of the Crusader states, but it was not an easy capital to sustain. The city lay inland, away from the main ports and trade routes. Its population had been devastated by conquest. The new rulers encouraged Christians from different communities to settle. Syrian Christians, Armenians, Greeks, and Western Europeans lived within its walls. Muslims were largely excluded at first, and Jewish life was severely reduced, though patterns changed over time. The kingdom depended on fortified towns, coastal ports, castles, military orders, and alliances. Its kings ruled a narrow and vulnerable realm surrounded by stronger Muslim states. For decades, division among those states helped the Crusaders survive. Muslim rulers in Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and Egypt often fought one another. The Crusader states became part of regional politics, sometimes making alliances with Muslim powers against other Muslims, just as Muslim rulers could cooperate with the Franks against rivals. The reality was more complicated than a single unbroken war between two religions. Merchants crossed frontiers. Prisoners were exchanged. Diplomats negotiated. Local Christians served in Eastern armies. Muslim peasants lived under Frankish lords. Arabic, Armenian, Greek, French, and Latin could be heard in the same region. Yet Jerusalem remained the great prize. In the mid-12th century, a new movement of Muslim political unity began under Zengi and his son Nur al-Din. Their struggle against the Crusader states was presented increasingly in the language of jihad. The recovery of Jerusalem became both a strategic and sacred goal. A Kurdish officer named Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub rose within this world. The West would remember him as Saladin. Saladin began his career in the service of Nur al-Din. Through military skill, political patience, and opportunity, he became ruler of Egypt, ended the Fatimid Caliphate there, and gradually built a realm that included Egypt and much of Syria. His greatest challenge was not merely defeating the Crusaders. It was uniting enough Muslim territory to make their defeat possible. He faced rivals, rebellions, uneasy alliances, and years of campaigning. He presented himself as a defender of Sunni Islam and a leader committed to recovering Jerusalem. Yet politics moved beside faith at every step. By the 1180s, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was weakened by succession disputes and factional conflict. King Baldwin IV, who suffered from leprosy, had held the kingdom together with remarkable determination, but his death left uncertainty. Guy of Lusignan became king through his marriage to Sibylla. Then one act helped push the region toward disaster. Reynald of Chatillon, lord of a fortress beyond the Jordan, repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans and threatened routes near the Red Sea. Saladin vowed revenge. When a truce broke down, he gathered a major army. The Crusader leadership faced a decision. They could remain near water and force Saladin to attack them in a strong position, or they could march across dry ground to relieve the city of Tiberias. They marched. On July 4th, 1187, near the Horns of Hattin, the Crusader army was surrounded, exhausted, and cut off from water. Smoke from burning grass blew into their ranks. Saladin's forces pressed them from every side. The army that protected Jerusalem collapsed. King Guy was captured. Reynald was brought before Saladin and killed. The relic of the true cross, carried into battle, was taken. Most of the kingdom's field army was dead or imprisoned. Jerusalem was now almost defenseless. This was the moment generations had awaited. But what happened next would determine whether Saladin was remembered only as a conqueror or as something more. City after city surrendered to Saladin. Acre fell. The coastal defenses of the Crusader kingdom broke apart. Refugees crowded into Jerusalem, bringing stories of defeat and fear. The defense was organized by Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman who had initially sought safe passage to retrieve his family. According to later accounts, the people of Jerusalem begged him to remain. He agreed, despite an oath that he would not take up arms against Saladin. Balian knighted men to strengthen the defense. Weapons were gathered. The walls were watched. Inside the city were thousands of civilians who knew what the Crusaders had done in 1099 and feared revenge. Saladin's army arrived in September 1187. The siege began. At first the fighting focused near the western walls. Then Saladin shifted his attack to the north, where the terrain favored siege operations. Miners worked beneath fortifications. Archers filled the air. Defenders made desperate sorties. The city could not hold for long. Balian opened negotiations. The stories of their exchange vary, but the central fact is clear. Jerusalem surrendered rather than being taken by storm. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered the city. There was no massacre like the one of 1099. Ransoms were required for many inhabitants, as was common in medieval warfare, and those who could not pay faced enslavement. Yet Saladin, his family, and officials freed many people, and Christian communities were not annihilated. Eastern Christians remained. The Holy Sepulchre was preserved. Latin clergy departed, but Christian pilgrimage later resumed under agreement. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were restored to Muslim worship. Christian symbols added during Crusader rule were removed. The sacred platform was cleansed ceremonially. The city had changed hands again. Saladin's restraint became part of his legend, especially when contrasted with the slaughter of 1099. That legend should not erase the suffering of those who were ransomed, displaced, or enslaved. Medieval mercy was not modern equality. But within the brutal standards of conquest, the surrender of 1187 was remembered as remarkable. Jerusalem had been recovered for Islam. The crusading movement did not end. News of the city's fall shocked Western Europe. The Third Crusade brought some of the age's most famous rulers east, including Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard and Saladin became legendary rivals, though they met only through envoys rather than face-to-face. Richard won major victories and recovered important coastal territory. He came close enough to Jerusalem for the city to haunt his campaign. Yet he hesitated to besiege it. Even if captured, could it be held? Water was scarce. Supply lines were vulnerable. A victory might become a trap. Twice, the Crusaders approached. Twice, they turned back. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 left Jerusalem under Muslim rule while allowing Christian pilgrims access. Richard departed without seeing the city he had come to recover. Saladin died the following year. His empire was divided among relatives. Ayyubid princes competed, negotiated, and sometimes allied with Crusader states against one another. Jerusalem remained sacred, but it was often strategically inconvenient. In 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, an Ayyubid ruler ordered the city's walls dismantled in several places. The fear was simple. If the Crusaders retook Jerusalem, strong walls would make it difficult to recover. The act revealed the city's strange military problem. Jerusalem was too holy to surrender easily and too difficult to defend confidently. In 1229, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II recovered Jerusalem not through battle, but through negotiation with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil. A treaty gave Christians control of much of the city and access to their holy places, while the Muslims' sacred precinct remained under Muslim administration. Frederick crowned himself in the Holy Sepulchre, but his achievement pleased almost no one completely. He was excommunicated. Local church authorities distrusted him. Muslim critics condemned the concession. The arrangement was temporary. Jerusalem returned to Muslim control, shifted again, and suffered new violence. In 1244, Khwarezmian forces allied with an Ayyubid ruler stormed the city. The Holy Sepulchre was attacked, and the remaining Latin Christian presence was shattered. The Crusader kingdom survived on the coast, but Jerusalem was lost to it for good. A new power soon dominated the region. The Mamluks began as elite military slaves, many brought from the Eurasian steppe and trained in Islamic courts. They seized power in Egypt in the 13th century and defeated both Crusaders and Mongols. In 1291, they captured Acre, ending the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland. Under Mamluk rule, Jerusalem was not a political capital. Cairo and Damascus mattered more to administration and empire. Yet the city became a major center of religious patronage. The Mamluks built schools, hospices, monasteries, fountains, markets, and elaborate entrances around the Haram al-Sharif. Their architecture still shapes the old city, especially along streets leading toward the sacred platform. Stone facades were decorated with alternating light and dark courses. Doorways carried inscriptions. Windows opened above narrow lanes. Endowments supported scholars, pilgrims, Sufis, and the poor. The city grew not through royal palaces, but through piety made architectural. Muslim families settled near the sanctuary. Scholars came to teach and study. Jerusalem's reputation in Islamic devotional literature deepened. The city was honored as the place of prophets and resurrection, the land of the night journey, and a destination whose holiness stood after Mecca and Medina. Christian pilgrims also continued to come. The journey could be difficult and expensive. Pilgrims paid taxes and negotiated with authorities. Different Christian communities competed over chapels, processions, and rites within the Holy Sepulchre. Franciscans established a lasting Western Christian presence and became custodians of many Latin holy sites. Jewish communities remained connected to Jerusalem as well, though their numbers rose and fell through persecution, economic hardship, disease, and migration. Visitors described prayer near the retaining walls of the former temple platform. Rabbinic scholars and mystics saw residence in the land, and especially in Jerusalem, as spiritually significant even when daily life was harsh. Jerusalem under the Mamluks was not a frozen medieval shrine. It was a living city of bakers, metalworkers, scholars, guards, porters, merchants, widows, children, pilgrims, and beggars. Grain entered through the gates. Water was stored in cisterns. Donkeys carried goods through streets too narrow for carts. News arrived from Cairo, Damascus, Anatolia, and beyond. Then, in the early 16th century, another empire took the city almost without the drama that usually announced Jerusalem's conquerors. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks and absorbed Syria, Egypt, and Jerusalem into his empire in 1516 and 1517. Ottoman rule would last for centuries. No other dynasty since antiquity would govern Jerusalem for so long. The early Ottoman age brought one of the city's most visible transformations. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent ordered the construction of new walls around Jerusalem in the 16th century. These are largely the walls seen today. They do not follow every earlier boundary. The city of David Ridge and Mount Zion lie partly outside them. But the walls gave Jerusalem its familiar silhouette: gates, towers, battlements, and long lines of pale stone enclosing the sacred core. The project was practical, symbolic, and imperial. Suleiman repaired water systems, supported religious institutions, and restored important monuments. The tiles that later covered the exterior of the Dome of the Rock reflected Ottoman patronage and artistic change. Fountains provided water along public routes. Inscriptions placed the Sultan's authority into the city's fabric. Jerusalem was now part of an empire that stretched across southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. It was not the Ottoman capital. It was not usually a major military center. Yet it mattered to a dynasty that ruled the three great Islamic holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The city's communities lived through systems shaped by religion, local custom, imperial law, and negotiation. Muslims formed the majority. Christians were divided among Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Ethiopian, and other communities. Jews included long-established local families and immigrants from across the Mediterranean and Middle East. The familiar division of the Old City into Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Armenian quarters developed gradually and was never as absolute as modern maps suggest. People owned property, worked, traded, and worshipped across boundaries. A street might be identified with one community while housing members of another. Sacred geography was precise, but daily life was entangled. At the Holy Sepulchre, Christian communities competed intensely over space and privilege. Which group could clean a stair? Which clergy could light lamps at a certain hour? Who controlled a chapel, a doorway, or a procession route? Arguments over inches could carry centuries of theology and political patronage. Ottoman authorities tried to regulate these conflicts through decrees and established arrangements. Over time, a system known as the status quo fixed many rights and practices among Christian communities. Its rules remain influential today. One small symbol captures the complexity. A wooden ladder rests on a ledge above the entrance to the Holy Sepulchre. It has remained in nearly the same place for generations because moving it could imply a claim over shared space. The ladder is ordinary wood. The dispute beneath it is anything but ordinary. Near the western retaining wall of the sacred platform, Jewish prayer became increasingly focused at a narrow, accessible section. The place was known in Jewish tradition as the Western Wall, and in older Western usage as the Wailing Wall. It was not the only point of devotion, but it became the most important public site of Jewish prayer near the former temple. People came to mourn destruction and hope for restoration. They recited psalms, pressed hands to stone, and remembered Jerusalem in languages spoken across exile. Muslims administered the surrounding area through religious endowments and understood the wall as part of the Haram complex, with traditions linking nearby places to Muhammad's night journey. The same stones carried different sacred meanings. For long periods, the tension remained managed through local arrangements. But the modern age would turn devotional attachment into national conflict. Before that transformation, Jerusalem passed through quieter centuries that are often ignored because they lack spectacular conquest. Governors changed. Taxes rose and fell. Earthquakes damaged buildings. Epidemics struck. Drought created hardship. Pilgrims arrived with coins that supported inns, guides, monasteries, and markets. Local notables mediated between residents and imperial officials. The city could feel remote. From Istanbul, at times, regional strongmen challenged Ottoman control. In the 17th and 18th centuries, local families accumulated influence. Janissaries, religious judges, guild leaders, and rural clans shaped politics. Order depended on compromise as much as command. Jerusalem's population remained relatively modest. Many travelers were surprised that the city of Scripture was smaller, poorer, and rougher than their imagination. They arrived expecting marble visions and found dust, crowded lanes, broken masonry, and bargaining at sacred doors. Some were disappointed. Others understood something essential. Jerusalem's power had never depended on comfort. It depended on the belief that eternity had touched a particular place. By the 19th century, that belief drew the attention of an expanding world. Steamships shortened journeys across the Mediterranean. Printing spread maps and travel accounts. European empires expanded their influence in Ottoman lands. Archaeologists, missionaries, diplomats, merchants, photographers, and pilgrims came to Jerusalem in growing numbers. Each arrived with a different city in mind. For Protestant visitors, Jerusalem was the landscape of the Bible, and many searched for physical proof of Scripture. Catholic and Orthodox powers competed to protect churches and communities. Russia built large compounds for pilgrims. France claimed ancient privileges as a guardian of Latin Christians. Britain established a consulate and watched the routes toward India and Egypt. Prussia entered the religious rivalry. European politics moved into monasteries, schools, hospitals, and property deeds. Jerusalem became a stage on which distant empires performed devotion. The Ottoman government responded to the changing age with reforms. New administrative systems, modern schools, postal services, roads, and communications slowly altered the city. The 19th century did not simply bring foreign pressure. It also brought local adaptation, entrepreneurship, journalism, education, and new forms of civic life among Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians, Jews from the Ottoman world, and immigrants from abroad. The city began to grow beyond its walls. For centuries, most residents had lived inside the crowded old city or in nearby religious institutions. Gates were closed at night. Sanitation was difficult. Housing was limited. As population increased, new neighborhoods appeared outside the walls. One of the earliest was Mishkanot Shananim, established west of the Old City in the 1860s with support from the Jewish philanthropist Moses Montefiore. At first, some residents feared living beyond the protection of the gates. A windmill rose above the new houses, intended to help the community become economically self-sufficient. More Jewish neighborhoods followed. At the same time, Arab, Christian, and Muslim families built homes beyond the walls, especially north and west of the city. Churches, monasteries, hospitals, and schools expanded. The Russian compound became a vast presence. The German colony developed southwest of the Old City. New roads connected Jerusalem to Jaffa, reducing a difficult journey that had once taken much longer. The city was no longer contained by Suleiman's walls. Its physical expansion carried social change. Wealthier families built larger houses with gardens and decorative stonework. Consulates and religious missions introduced European architectural styles. Local builders adapted them to Jerusalem limestone and regional traditions. The old city of alleys remained sacred. The new city of institutions was becoming modern. Photography changed how the world saw Jerusalem. Early images showed walls, domes, pilgrims, shepherds, markets, and ruins. Because long exposure times favored still scenes, the photographs often made the city appear timeless and empty. Yet behind the camera stood a crowded urban society in motion. By the late 19th century, photographers connected with the American colony created a remarkable visual record. The American colony itself began as a Christian communal group founded by American and Swedish believers. Its members provided charity, medical assistance, and relief during war and famine. Their photographs captured ceremonies, streets, soldiers, families, landscapes, and the transformation of Palestine through the final Ottoman decades and into the British period. The images reveal something written histories often miss. Jerusalem was not only rulers and sacred monuments. It was faces, a water seller carrying a skin through the street, women baking bread, Armenian clergy in procession, Jewish worshippers near the Western Wall, Muslim families gathering for festivals, children looking directly into a camera they may never have seen before, Ottoman soldiers standing beside ancient stone. The sacred city was also an ordinary home, but the political ideas shaping that home were changing. Across Europe, modern nationalism taught peoples to imagine themselves as nations with shared histories, languages, and political destinies. For Jews facing persecution, exclusion, and violent anti-Semitism, Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as a movement seeking a national home in the ancestral land. Jerusalem held immense symbolic power within Zionism, though early practical settlement and political activity often focused on other towns and agricultural colonies. The city was difficult, conservative, poor, and filled with competing religious authorities. Yet no vision of Jewish national return could ignore Zion. Jewish immigration to Ottoman Palestine increased in waves. Some immigrants came from Eastern Europe, others from Yemen and elsewhere. They joined long-established Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewish communities whose families had lived under Ottoman rule for generations. The Jewish population of Jerusalem grew significantly during the 19th century and became the city's largest religious group by many contemporary estimates. Though census categories, residency patterns, and numbers remain subjects of historical discussion. Arabic-speaking residents watched these changes with mixed reactions. Some welcomed economic development and sold land. Some worked with new institutions. Some saw immigrants as neighbors or fellow Ottoman subjects. Others feared that organized settlement and foreign political support threatened the future of the country's Arab population. Palestinian Arab identity developed gradually from local loyalties, Ottoman citizenship, broader Arab cultural revival, religious affiliation, and attachment to the land. Jerusalem became a center of Arabic newspapers, education, family politics, and religious leadership. Two national movements were beginning to look toward the same city. Neither had yet achieved sovereignty. Both believed history supported its claim, and an empire that had governed the city for 400 years was weakening. The final Ottoman decades were filled with contradiction. The railway from Jaffa reached Jerusalem in 1892, bringing passengers through hills once crossed by mule and carriage. Telegraph lines connected the city to distant capitals. Hotels received tourists. Guidebooks directed visitors through sacred routes. Shops sold photographs and relics. In 1898, the German Emperor Wilhelm II visited Jerusalem. To accommodate his ceremonial entrance near Jaffa Gate, part of the area beside the gate was opened and the moat filled, allowing carriages to pass more easily. The ancient wall had not been conquered. It had been altered for imperial theater. The emperor's procession reflected the changing balance of power. The Ottoman Sultan still ruled Jerusalem, but European states operated within the city with growing confidence. Religious institutions purchased land. Foreign flags appeared above compounds. Archaeological expeditions cut into hillsides, often driven by biblical questions and imperial competition. Excavation promised knowledge. It also introduced a new struggle over the past. Archaeologists explored tunnels, walls, tombs, inscriptions, and ancient water systems. Their discoveries transformed understanding of Jerusalem's development. Yet excavation was never entirely neutral. A trench could challenge tradition, strengthen a religious narrative, or support a national claim. Local residents could be displaced or ignored. Objects left the region for foreign collections. Beneath Jerusalem, history was becoming political evidence. Then came World War. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. Jerusalem, far from the great European fronts, was pulled into a conflict that devastated the Eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman authorities mobilized men, requisitioned animals and food, and imposed military demands. Trade collapsed. Hunger spread across the region. Locusts destroyed crops in 1915. Disease and shortages struck civilians. Communities suspected of disloyalty faced surveillance, deportation, or pressure. The sacred city suffered without a siege. Residents waited in bread lines. Charitable organizations struggled to provide relief. The American colony helped operate soup kitchens and hospitals. The war reduced people of many faiths to the same urgent questions: where to find flour, how to keep children alive, whether absent relatives would return. By 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby advanced from Egypt into Palestine. Ottoman defenses weakened. After battles in the south and the capture of Jaffa, the British moved toward the Judean hills. Jerusalem stood before another conqueror. The Ottoman authorities withdrew rather than turn the sacred city into a battlefield. The surrender itself became almost accidental. The mayor of Jerusalem, carrying a white flag, tried repeatedly to find a British officer of sufficient rank to accept it. The city was reportedly offered first to ordinary soldiers who had gone out searching for supplies. On December 11, 1917, General Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot through Jaffa Gate. He deliberately avoided riding, presenting the gesture as respect for the holy city and contrasting himself with earlier imperial visitors. Bells rang. Crowds gathered. A proclamation promised protection for sacred sites and existing religious customs. For centuries of Ottoman rule had ended. British control began with ceremony. Its consequences would be anything but peaceful. Even before Allenby entered Jerusalem, the British government had issued the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. It expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while stating that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. The words were brief. Their contradictions were immense. Britain had made wartime commitments and suggestions to different parties whose hopes could not easily be reconciled. Arab leaders expected independence after revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Zionist leaders saw the declaration as international recognition of Jewish national aspirations. Palestinian Arabs saw a foreign power promising their country to another people without their consent. Jerusalem became the administrative center of the British Mandate for Palestine, formally approved by the League of Nations in the early 1920s. British planners imagined themselves as guardians standing above communal conflict. They introduced new regulations, courts, roads, urban plans, and government buildings. They tried to preserve the visual character of Jerusalem by requiring stone facing on construction, a rule that helped give the modern city its distinctive pale appearance. They also inherited a conflict their own policy intensified. The British governed through categories. Communities became political blocs. Religious identities became administrative units. Statistics became weapons. Every census, immigration figure, land purchase, and building permit could be read as evidence of a future majority or minority. Jerusalem's neighborhoods expanded rapidly. Jewish districts grew westward. Arab neighborhoods developed north, south, and east of the Old City. New schools, cinemas, hospitals, cafes, newspapers, clubs, and political organizations created a lively urban culture. Hebrew and Arabic modernized as public languages. English entered administration. The city sounded different. Church bells, calls to prayer, and synagogue chants remained. Now they mixed with automobile horns, construction, radio broadcasts, political speeches, and the whistles of British police. For a time, it was possible to imagine that modernization might soften the conflict. It did not. In 1920, violence erupted during the Nebi Musa festival. Arabs attacked Jews in the Old City, and fighting exposed the weakness of British security. Political leaders blamed one another and accused the administration of failure. In 1921, violence elsewhere in Palestine deepened fear. Jewish defense organizations developed. Arab political opposition to Zionism and British rule intensified. The Western Wall became a flashpoint. For Jews, the wall was the most sacred accessible place of prayer, tied to the temple and centuries of longing. For Muslims, it formed part of the Haram al-Sharif compound and stood beside the Moroccan quarter, whose residents and religious endowments had long surrounded the area. Small changes carried enormous meaning. A screen placed for prayer, a bench, a flag, a procession, or a sermon could be interpreted as the beginning of an attempt to seize control. Rumors spread faster than official corrections. In August 1929, tension exploded into violence across Palestine. In Jerusalem and other towns, Jews were attacked and killed. Jewish reprisals and British gunfire also caused Arab deaths. The ancient Jewish community of Hebron was devastated in a massacre, and survivors were evacuated. In Jerusalem, fear hardened communal boundaries. The city was learning the politics of rumor. A story about a threatened holy place could mobilize thousands before anyone knew whether it was true. During the 1930s, Jewish immigration increased sharply as persecution in Europe intensified, especially after the Nazis came to power in Germany. For Jews fleeing anti-Semitism, Palestine could mean survival. For Palestinian Arabs, growing immigration appeared to confirm fears of dispossession and political replacement. Both experiences were real. They collided in the same land. The Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939 began with strikes and developed into a major uprising against British rule and Zionist immigration. Jerusalem became a center of protest, repression, assassination, and political struggle. British forces imposed curfews, arrested leaders, demolished houses, and fought guerrillas. Palestinian society suffered deep damage, and its political leadership became divided or exiled. Jewish institutions expanded their defensive and political organization. The Haganah developed. More militant underground groups, including the Irgun, used violence against Arabs and later against the British. Britain searched for a solution and repeatedly changed direction. Commissions proposed partition. White papers limited immigration. Policies satisfied no one. Then Europe descended into catastrophe. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews. Communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Survivors emerged from camps and hiding places into a world that had failed them. Many sought entry to Palestine, but British restrictions remained. For the Zionist movement, Jewish statehood was no longer only a historical dream or political program. It had become an urgent answer to statelessness and annihilation. For Palestinian Arabs, the same project threatened loss of homeland and majority status for a crime they had not committed. Jerusalem stood at the center of two tragedies moving toward one another. The The British Mandate was running out of time. After the Second World War, Britain faced armed resistance, international pressure, and a conflict it could no longer control. Jewish underground groups attacked British targets. Arab opposition remained determined. Refugee ships carrying Holocaust survivors drew global attention when British forces turned them away or detained their passengers. Jerusalem became a city of checkpoints and hidden weapons. British soldiers searched buses. Underground fighters moved through familiar streets. Government offices operated behind barbed wire. Hotels and compounds became fortified zones. On July 22, 1946, the Irgun bombed the southern wing of the King David Hotel, which housed British administrative and military offices. 91 people were killed, including Arabs, Jews, British citizens, and others. The building stood not far from the old city. Its shattered windows revealed how completely sacred geography had become modern battleground. Britain referred the Palestine question to the newly created United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning the land into Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem and nearby Bethlehem were to form an international zone under special administration because of their unique religious importance. The Jewish leadership accepted the partition plan despite reservations. Arab leaders rejected it as unjust, arguing that the Arab majority of the country was being forced to surrender land and political rights to a largely immigrant national movement. The vote did not create peace. It began civil war. In Jerusalem, the conflict was immediate. The city contained Jewish and Arab neighborhoods connected by vulnerable roads. The main route from the coastal plain to Jewish western Jerusalem passed through areas where Arab fighters could attack convoys. Supplies became scarce. Fuel, food, and medicine had to move through ambush zones. The road to Jerusalem became a symbol of survival. Armored trucks climbed toward the city. Some were improvised with metal plating and narrow windows. Convoys were attacked in steep passes. Burned vehicles remained beside the road as monuments to failed attempts. Inside Jerusalem, snipers fired across boundaries. Bombs struck markets and streets. Residents learned which corners were exposed. Hospitals received the wounded faster than they could treat them. The separation of communities accelerated. Mixed districts emptied. Families abandoned homes carrying keys, documents, blankets, and whatever could be moved quickly. Neighbors who had known one another for years disappeared behind lines that were not yet official borders. One of the darkest events occurred on April 9, 1948, at Deir Yassin, a Palestinian Arab village west of Jerusalem. Fighters from the Irgun and Lehi attacked the village and killed more than 100 inhabitants, including women and children. The exact circumstances of individual deaths were debated, but the massacre's impact was unmistakable. News spread through Palestinian communities and magnified fear. For days later, Arab fighters ambushed a convoy traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. 78 Jewish medical personnel, patients, university workers, guards, and others were killed. Each atrocity became proof of what the other side feared most. Each burial made compromise harder. On May 14, 1948, the leaders of the Jewish community declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Britain ended its mandate and withdrew. Armies from neighboring Arab states entered the war. Jerusalem became a battlefield between the new Israeli forces and the Arab Legion of Transjordan, one of the best-trained Arab armies. The old city was surrounded by fighting. The Jewish quarter inside its walls had been under siege. Supplies dwindled. Positions fell one by one. On May 28, the quarter surrendered to the Arab Legion. Its remaining Jewish civilians were expelled, and defenders became prisoners. Synagogues were damaged or destroyed in the months and years that followed. West of the walls, Israeli forces held most Jewish neighborhoods. The Arab Legion held the Old City and East Jerusalem. Battles raged around Latron, where attempts to open the main road failed at heavy cost. An alternative route, later called the Burma Road, was cut through the hills to supply western Jerusalem. Water lines were threatened. Food remained scarce. Yet the city did not fall. By the end of the war, Jerusalem was divided. A ceasefire line ran through neighborhoods, gardens, roads, and institutional grounds. It was drawn on a map in green pencil and became known as the Green Line. Jordan controlled the Old City and East Jerusalem. Israel controlled West Jerusalem. The international city proposed by the United Nations never came into existence. The war created a new political reality and a human catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs became refugees, expelled or fleeing from homes in cities and villages across the country. Palestinians remember this as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Many Arab residents of Western Jerusalem lost houses and property they could not return to. Neighborhoods such as Talbiya, Canaan, and Bakkeh changed population dramatically. Jewish communities in the Old City and areas under Jordanian control were displaced as well. Across the wider Middle East in the following years, Jewish communities faced rising hostility, violence, state pressure, and mass immigration. Many came to Israel, reshaping the population of the new state. Jerusalem absorbed loss from every direction. Families moved into homes whose former owners were now refugees. Synagogues occupied buildings once used for something else. Government offices opened in converted houses. Keys remained in drawers. Books remained on shelves. Gardens bloomed for people who could no longer reach them. A city of memory became a city of absences. Israel declared Jerusalem its capital and established government institutions in the western part, though most countries did not recognize sovereignty over the city and kept embassies elsewhere. Jordan annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, a move recognized by only a small number of states. Between the two sectors lay a frontier of walls, fences, minefields, and ruined buildings. At Mandelbaum Gate, limited crossings took place under strict control. Diplomats, clergy, and certain authorized travelers passed from one side to the other. For ordinary residents, places visible across the line became unreachable. A Jewish resident of West Jerusalem could see the old city walls but could not pray at the Western Wall. A Palestinian family in East Jerusalem might see a former home across no man's land but could not return. The city was close enough to touch and impossible to cross. Mount Scopus became an Israeli enclave within Jordanian-held territory. Convoys traveled there under agreement. The Hebrew University and Hadassah hospital buildings stood isolated, largely unable to serve their original purpose. The old city under Jordanian rule remained home to Muslim and Christian communities. The Haram al-Sharif and Christian holy places continued their religious life. Major repairs were carried out at the Dome of the Rock. Pilgrims came, though access was shaped by regional politics. The Jewish quarter remained largely emptied of its former residents. The Western Wall was inaccessible to Jews. Jewish cemeteries on the Mount of Olives suffered damage and neglect, with some stones reportedly used for construction. West Jerusalem developed as Israel's political and cultural center. The Knesset, Supreme Court of the period, government ministries, museums, and new neighborhoods took shape. Immigrants arrived from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Hebrew became the language of public life among people whose families had spoken Yiddish, Arabic, Russian, Polish, German, Ladino, Persian, and many others. The city was united in administration on each side and divided in reality. Then, in June 1967, war transformed Jerusalem in 6 days. Tension across the region had escalated. Egypt moved troops into Sinai and closed the Straits of Tiran. Alliances and military plans drew Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria toward conflict. On June 5, Israel launched attacks against Egyptian airfields. Jordan entered the war despite Israeli messages urging it to remain outside, and fighting began in Jerusalem. Artillery struck West Jerusalem. Israeli and Jordanian forces battled around Government House, Ammunition Hill, and positions controlling routes toward the Old City. Ammunition Hill became one of the fiercest encounters. Israeli paratroopers attacked fortified Jordanian trenches in darkness. Fighting took place at close range through narrow earthworks. By morning, many soldiers on both sides were dead. The road to the Old City opened. On June 7th, Israeli paratroopers entered through Lion's Gate. They moved onto the Haram al-Sharif and then down to the Western Wall. The moment was broadcast by radio. Soldiers wept. Some touched the stones. The chief military rabbi sounded a shofar. For Jews around the world, the return to the Western Wall after 19 years of separation and after centuries without Jewish sovereignty in the Old City carried overwhelming emotional force. For Palestinian residents, the same event meant military occupation and the loss of Jordanian rule. One city's liberation was another city's conquest. That double reality has never disappeared. Israel expanded the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem and applied its law and administration to East Jerusalem and surrounding areas. It later declared the city united under Israeli sovereignty. Most of the international community has not recognized the annexation and regards East Jerusalem as occupied territory whose final status must be resolved through negotiation. Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state. The city was physically reunited. Politically, it remained divided. Within days of the 1967 war, the Moroccan quarter beside the Western Wall was demolished. Its residents were removed, and the narrow prayer area was opened into the broad plaza seen today. The change created space for large Jewish gatherings, but erased a centuries-old neighborhood and transformed the relationship between the wall and the surrounding city. Israeli authorities faced an immediate decision at the sacred platform above. The Israeli flag was briefly raised and then removed. Day-to-day religious administration of the Haram al-Sharif remained with the Islamic Waqf, while Israel controlled external security and access. Muslims continued to worship at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Non-Muslims could visit under restrictions, while Jewish prayer on the platform was limited by policy and religious rulings, though the issue grew increasingly contested. The arrangement was designed to prevent a religious explosion. It also ensured that every gate, excavation, prayer, and police decision could become political. The Jewish quarter was rebuilt. Former residents and new families moved in. Synagogues were restored or reconstructed. Archaeological excavation exposed layers from the First and Second Temple periods, the Roman city, Byzantine Jerusalem, and medieval eras. The work produced major discoveries. It also changed the neighborhood physically and raised questions about which layer of history would be preserved, displayed, or removed. Jerusalem had always been built on earlier cities. Now that process was guided by national institutions with modern power. Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem came under Israeli municipal rule, but most Palestinian residents received permanent residency rather than automatic citizenship. They could apply for citizenship under certain conditions, though many did not, whether for political, bureaucratic, or personal reasons. The city offered shared roads, hospitals, markets, and workplaces. It did not offer equal experience. Israeli neighborhoods and settlements were built in areas captured in 1967, creating a ring that reshaped the city's geography and demography. Palestinians faced restrictions, land disputes, residency concerns, and difficulty obtaining building permits. Israeli residents faced attacks, war, and fears that division could threaten access and security. Every map became an argument. Where did Jerusalem begin? Where should it end? Which neighborhood was ancient, legal, natural, strategic, or sacred? Lines drawn by planners could determine the future of families who had never seen the map. The city grew larger than at any earlier moment in its history. Yet the old city remained its emotional center. Within, less than 1 square kilometer, the most powerful memories of 3 religions pressed against one another. The Western Wall stood below the Haram al-Sharif. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre lay a short walk away. The Via Dolorosa crossed crowded markets. Armenian monasteries occupied ancient compounds. Minarets rose above Crusader arches and Roman columns. A person could walk across centuries in minutes. That closeness created wonder. It also created danger. In August 1969, an Australian Christian extremist set fire to Al-Aqsa Mosque. The blaze damaged the building and destroyed a historic pulpit associated with Saladin's restoration of the sanctuary. Muslims around the world reacted with grief and anger. The attacker was arrested and found mentally ill, but many suspected a wider plot. The fire demonstrated how one individual could threaten a global crisis. Jerusalem did not need an army to ignite. It needed a rumor and smoke above a sacred roof. After 1967, Israeli and Palestinian national movements both intensified their connection to the city. Israeli state ceremonies emphasized reunification and historic return. Palestinian institutions, families, religious authorities, and political organizations defended Arab presence in East Jerusalem and the Old City. The city became not only a desired capital, it became proof of existence. To yield Jerusalem could feel like yielding history itself. In 1980, Israel's parliament passed a basic law declaring Jerusalem, complete and united, the capital of Israel. The United Nations Security Council rejected measures that altered the status of the city and called on states with embassies there to withdraw them. The diplomatic argument could sound technical. For residents, it entered ordinary life. A street address could determine which courts, schools, taxes, permits, and identity documents shaped a family. A house built on one side of a former boundary might have a different legal future from a house across the road. A marriage could involve residency rules. A child born in one neighborhood might face a different path to citizenship than a child born minutes away. Jerusalem was united on official Israeli maps. In daily experience, several Jerusalems existed at once. There was the Israeli government city of parliament, ministries, memorials, universities, and museums. There was Palestinian East Jerusalem, connected culturally, economically, and politically to the West Bank yet administered by Israel. There was the Old City, where sacred institutions held rights older than modern states. There were ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods organized around yeshivas and religious courts. There were secular districts of cafes, theaters, and students. There were Armenian courtyards, Christian monasteries, refugee camps, new suburbs, and ancient villages absorbed into municipal boundaries. These cities touched. They did not always meet. In December 1987, the First Intifada began in Gaza and spread through the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. It was a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, expressed through demonstrations, strikes, stone throwing, boycotts, underground organization, and at times armed violence. Israel responded with arrests, force, curfews, and security measures. Jerusalem became both symbol and arena. Palestinian shops in East Jerusalem closed during strikes. Political leaflets circulated. Funerals became demonstrations. Israeli police patrolled streets where children grew up under the shadow of the old city walls. The uprising changed the conflict. It showed that military control could not erase Palestinian national demands. It also deepened Israeli fears of violence and insecurity. In 1993, Israeli and Palestinian representatives signed the Oslo Accords. The world watched leaders shake hands in Washington. The agreements created a process of limited Palestinian self-government in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Jerusalem was left for final negotiations. That postponement revealed the problem. The issue most capable of destroying an agreement was saved for later, as though time would make it easier. Time did not. For Israelis, Jerusalem represented historical return, national capital, and access to sacred places denied before 1967. For Palestinians, East Jerusalem represented homeland, political center, and the natural capital of a future state. The old city's holy sites carried claims that could not be divided like ordinary land. A proposal about sovereignty over a road could be negotiated. A proposal about sovereignty over the place believed to connect earth and heaven touched identity at its deepest level. During the 1990s, peace talks continued beside attacks and mistrust. Palestinian militants carried out bombings that killed Israeli civilians. Israeli extremists also used violence. In 1994, a Jewish extremist massacred Muslim worshippers in Hebron, shaking the region. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish extremist in 1995 destroyed a leader central to the peace process. Jerusalem felt every shock. Security increased. Buses became targets. Checkpoints hardened. Political rhetoric made compromise sound like betrayal. In 2000, negotiations at Camp David attempted to address the final issues, including Jerusalem. Ideas were discussed for divided sovereignty, shared arrangements, and control of holy places. No agreement emerged. Later that year, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the sacred platform under heavy security. The visit came during a period of intense tension. Palestinians saw it as a provocation and a claim of sovereignty. Protests erupted. Israeli police used deadly force during clashes. The Second Intifada began. The uprising became far more militarized and lethal than the first. Palestinian suicide bombings struck buses, cafes, and public spaces, killing Israeli civilians. Israeli forces carried out raids, targeted killings, arrests, and military operations that killed militants and civilians. Fear entered routines. In Jerusalem, people studied the faces of passengers. Guards stood at restaurant doors. Parents called children to ask whether they had reached home. A journey of 15 minutes could become an hour of checkpoints and blocked roads. The city's sacred image remained on postcards. Its residents lived with sirens. Israel constructed a separation barrier through and around the West Bank. In the Jerusalem area, the barrier followed a route that Israel described as necessary for security, but which did not simply match the 1967 boundary. It reduced attacks inside Israel, while Palestinians experienced land loss, difficult movement, economic isolation, and separation from schools, hospitals, relatives, and the urban center of East Jerusalem. Concrete walls appeared in landscapes once defined by ancient stone terraces. Neighborhoods that were officially inside Jerusalem could find themselves physically cut off from the rest of the city. People carrying Jerusalem residency documents passed checkpoints to reach jobs or medical care. The map became even more complex. Yet ordinary life continued. That may be Jerusalem's most remarkable pattern. After every war, someone opens a bakery. After every riot, children return to school. After every diplomatic collapse, merchants raise metal shutters in the old city and arrange spices, crosses, prayer rugs, ceramics, books, jewelry, and bread for another day. The city survives through repetition. At dawn, Muslim worshippers climb toward Al-Aqsa. Jewish worshippers enter the Western Wall Plaza. Priests unlock church doors. Municipal workers sweep streets walked by conquerors. Delivery carts pass beneath arches built centuries earlier. A city famous for the end of the world must still collect garbage. This ordinary Jerusalem rarely appears in grand history, yet it is the city most residents know. Consider the old city in the early morning. The stones are damp in winter. Shop doors are closed. Cats move through alleys. A baker carries trays of sesame-covered bread balanced high. The smell reaches streets before the sun does. Near the Holy Sepulchre, clergy from different Christian communities begin ceremonies governed by ancient schedules. Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Roman Catholic, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian Christians share the church through arrangements that can appear bewildering to outsiders. No single community controls everything. Altars, chapels, roofs, stairways, lamps, and times of prayer are divided with precision. The complexity is often portrayed as evidence of endless quarrel. It is also evidence that communities which disagree profoundly have remained in the same building for centuries. The church itself is a history of destruction and repair. Constantine's original complex was damaged by Persian conquest, restored, destroyed under Al-Hakim, rebuilt by Byzantine patrons, transformed by crusaders, repaired after fires and earthquakes, and supported by later restorations. Its dark interior does not present a perfect archaeological reconstruction of the first century. It presents something different. It is the accumulated architecture of belief. Pilgrims kneel at the stone of anointing. They climb steep steps toward the chapel of Calvary. They wait in line to enter the small shrine enclosing the tomb. Some arrive after saving money for years. Some weep before they understand why. Outside, a Muslim family has traditionally held the key to the church, while another Muslim family is associated with the duty of opening and closing its door. The arrangement developed through long history and symbolizes a practical trust placed beyond the competing Christian communities. Jerusalem's peace has often depended on such small inheritances, not treaties written by presidents. Keys passed from parent to child. At the Western Wall, the plaza changes with the hour. At quiet times, individuals stand almost alone against the immense stones. On festivals, military ceremonies, and national days, thousands gather. Bar and bat mitzvah celebrations bring music and dancing. On the 9th of Av, worshippers mourn the destruction of the temples. Notes are placed into cracks in the wall. The papers contain prayers for health, children, forgiveness, work, love, safety, and peace. Most will never be read by another person. Their power lies in being left where generations have brought grief and hope. Above the wall rises the sacred platform known to Muslims as Al-Haram al-Sharif and to Jews as the Temple Mount. No place in Jerusalem carries greater potential for wonder or conflict. For Jews, it is the site of the first and second temples, the holiest place in Judaism. Traditional Jewish law led many rabbis to forbid entry to parts or all of the platform because the location of the most sacred ancient areas is uncertain. Other religious national groups increasingly advocate Jewish visits and prayer there. For Muslims, the compound contains Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and is one of Islam's most sacred places. It is a living center of worship, education, family gathering, and Palestinian identity, not merely an archaeological platform waiting beneath later buildings. The same ground is not experienced in the same way. One tradition looks toward a destroyed temple. Another worships within an existing sanctuary. Any attempt to treat one as invisible threatens the other. This is why small incidents become global news. A changed entrance rule, a police raid, a political visit, a rumor of excavation, or a group praying where prayer was previously restricted can be interpreted as the opening move in a campaign to take the site. History in Jerusalem is rarely past. It is evidence submitted in the present tense. Archaeology carries the same burden. Excavations have revealed fortifications, water systems, seals, coins, houses, streets, ritual baths, churches, mosques, and markets from many eras. They have deepened knowledge of the city and allowed people to walk through spaces hidden for centuries. But archaeology also asks dangerous questions. Which period receives funding? Which remains are preserved? Which modern homes stand above them? What names appear on signs? Does an excavation explain the past or claim the future? In the area south of the Old City, often called the City of David, archaeological work has uncovered major remains from ancient Jerusalem. The site is located within and beside the Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan. Israeli organizations emphasize its connection to biblical David and Jewish origins. Palestinian residents argue that archaeology and tourism are being used to strengthen Israeli control and settlement in their neighborhood. The stones are real. So is the struggle around them. A responsible history must hold both facts at once. Jerusalem's ancient Jewish past is not invented. Jerusalem's living Palestinian present is not an obstacle to be erased. The city becomes more truthful when none of its peoples are reduced to a footnote. The same principle applies to Christianity. Jerusalem is often described as a city of two national movements and three religions, but its Christian communities are not museum pieces between larger forces. Palestinian Christians, Armenians, Greek Orthodox clergy, Latin Catholics, Ethiopians, Copts, Syriacs, and Protestants each carry distinct histories. Some communities have lived in the city for many centuries. Some preserve liturgies in ancient languages. Some face declining numbers, economic pressure, immigration, property disputes, and restrictions. Yet bells still ring because people still live the traditions those bells announce. The Armenian quarter offers one of the clearest examples of survival. Armenians established a presence in Jerusalem in late antiquity and built enduring religious institutions. Their quarter grew around the Cathedral of St. James. Manuscripts, ceramics, printing, scholarship, and pilgrimage linked Jerusalem's Armenians to a global diaspora shaped by trade and, later, the trauma of genocide. During the First World War, survivors of the Armenian genocide reached Jerusalem. The city became refuge as well as shrine. The Armenian community's numbers are small compared with the major national populations, yet its presence prevents Jerusalem from being reduced to a simple map of two sides. The city has always contained more than the argument of the moment. Walk farther, and the layers continue. Roman columns stand beside medieval shops. A Mamluk school may face an Ottoman fountain. A Crusader arch supports a modern apartment. Electrical cables cross stone carved before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Satellite dishes rise above roofs governed by religious endowments created centuries ago. Jerusalem does not preserve history by keeping it untouched. It preserves history by forcing it to live. To understand why Jerusalem cannot be treated like an ordinary capital, we must listen to the names people have given it. Yerushalayim, Al-Quds, the Holy City, Zion, Elia, Beit el-Maqdis. Each name carries a map of memory. For Jews, Jerusalem is woven through prayer and ritual even when the worshiper is thousands of miles away. Traditional prayers face toward the city. The Passover Seder ends with the hope of being in Jerusalem in the coming year. Weddings remember destruction even at their moment of greatest joy. often through the breaking of a glass and the recitation of words refusing to forget Jerusalem. This memory survived empires because it entered the calendar and the home. A government can ban a pilgrimage. It is harder to ban a direction of prayer. The Jewish connection to Jerusalem is not only political and not only archaeological. It is liturgical. Psalms speak of Zion. Prophets imagine nations coming to the city. Rabbinic texts debate its holiness. Medieval poets long for it. Communities from Spain, Yemen, Poland, Morocco, Iraq, Ethiopia, Persia, and elsewhere carried different cultures yet shared the name of Jerusalem. For many centuries, longing was stronger than access. That distance shaped the city of the imagination. Jerusalem became perfect because it was absent. The actual city might be poor, dangerous, or ruled by someone else. The remembered city was built of promise. When modern Jewish immigrants arrived, they did not encounter an empty biblical landscape. They encountered an Ottoman and then Palestinian society with its own memories, homes, shrines, and claims. The meeting between sacred return and lived presence lies near the heart of the modern conflict. One people arrived carrying keys made of prayer. Another already carried the keys to houses standing on the land. For Christians, Jerusalem is the setting of the final drama of Jesus' earthly life. The city contains the remembered path from the Mount of Olives to Gethsemane, from arrest to trial, from crucifixion to burial, and from burial to resurrection. The Gospels transform Jerusalem into both a place of rejection and the place where salvation is revealed. The city is earthly and heavenly, condemned and promised, destroyed and renewed. Christian pilgrims do not all walk the same route or interpret every site in the same way. Traditions developed across centuries, sometimes shifting as buildings rose and fell. The Via Dolorosa, followed today, took shape through medieval and later devotion. The exact location of every event cannot be proven. Yet pilgrimage is not only a search for coordinates. It is a way of entering a story with the body. A pilgrim climbs steps and feels fatigue, kneels on stone and feels cold, waits in a crowd and feels impatience, hears prayers in languages not understood and feels part of something older than nationality. That physical encounter is why Jerusalem mattered so much to medieval Christianity. A believer in France or Ethiopia could hear scripture for years, but in Jerusalem the landscape seemed to answer back. Here was a hill. Here was a garden. Here was a tomb. The city turned belief into geography. This same power attracted conquest. Once a place is believed to contain sacred history, control of that place can be presented as defense of the faith. The First Crusade was the most dramatic example, but not the only one. Empires repeatedly portrayed their rule as protection. Byzantines protecting Christian sites, Muslim dynasties protecting the Haram, Ottomans protecting all recognized communities, European powers protecting particular churches, Britain protecting the holy places, Israel protecting access after 1967, Jordan preserving its custodial role, Palestinians defending Arab and Islamic presence. Protection is one of Jerusalem's most dangerous words. It can mean care. It can also mean control. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the city of the night journey and the sacred sanctuary. The Quran does not name Jerusalem directly in the verse describing the journey to the farthest mosque, but Islamic tradition identified that destination with Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. From there, Muhammad is believed to have ascended through the heavens, meeting earlier prophets and approaching the divine presence. The story connects Jerusalem to Mecca and to the chain of prophecy. It also connects Islam to the city's Jewish and Christian past without simply becoming either one. Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Mary, and Jesus are honored within Islam. Their city becomes part of a sacred history completed and reinterpreted through the message of Muhammad. The Dome of the Rock makes that claim visible. Its architecture speaks before anyone reads its inscriptions. The building stands where the skyline opens. Its proportions are calm. Its mosaics combine artistic worlds. Its dome appears to float above the walls. Yet the shrine's beauty can obscure its boldness. It was built by a new empire confident enough to place a new religious monument beside and above the memories of older faiths. It declared that Islam had entered the history of Jerusalem permanently. More than 13 centuries later, that declaration still stands. Al-Aqsa Mosque, at the southern end of the platform, is equally important to Muslim worship, though visitors often confuse it with the Golden Domed Shrine. The broader sanctuary includes gates, arcades, schools, fountains, prayer areas, and open stone courtyards shaded by ancient trees. For generations of Jerusalem families, the compound is not an abstract symbol. It is where grandparents prayed, where children played during festivals, where students learned, where funerals passed, and where community life unfolded. This difference between global symbol and local home matters. To outsiders, Jerusalem's holy places can appear like pieces on a religious chessboard. To residents, they are part of a weekly routine. The sacred calendar changes the city again and again. During Ramadan, evenings around the old city fill with light, food, movement, and worship. Families break the fast. Vendors work late. Thousands may gather for prayer at Al-Aqsa. The nights feel both festive and solemn. During Holy Week, Christian processions move through narrow streets. Pilgrims carry crosses along the Via Dolorosa. At the Holy Sepulchre, the ceremonies of Good Friday, Easter, and the Holy Fire draw worshippers from many countries. During Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and other Jewish festivals, worshippers gather at the Western Wall and throughout the city. On Yom Kippur, traffic in Jewish neighborhoods largely disappears and streets become quiet. Calendars overlap. Sometimes festivals bring beauty. Sometimes they bring tension, especially when large crowds, political movements, and security forces converge near the same sacred gates. Jerusalem lives by rhythms older than the states that govern it. The weekly cycle itself is visible. Friday brings Muslim congregational prayer. Friday evening begins the Jewish Sabbath, transforming many neighborhoods as shops close and families gather. Sunday brings Christian worship and bells from churches across the city. No single weekend contains Jerusalem. Even time is shared unevenly. Language marks these worlds. Hebrew and Arabic dominate modern public life, while English reaches tourists and diplomats. Armenian appears on signs in its quarter. Greek, Latin, Guizi, Russian, French, German, and many other languages enter through churches and pilgrim groups. Ancient words survive within modern arguments. A street may have different names in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Each name can honor a different person, event, or historical layer. A map designed for one community may guide another through a city it barely recognizes. Naming is never innocent here. After 1967, many places received or recovered Hebrew names tied to biblical or historical tradition. Palestinians continued to use Arabic names tied to family, neighborhood, and local memory. Tour guides selected terminology according to audience and belief. Is the elevated compound the Temple Mount or Al-Haram al-Sharif? Is the barrier a security fence or a separation wall? Is a neighborhood built beyond the 1967 Line A neighborhood or a settlement? The choice of a word can announce an entire political position. A careful history must sometimes use more than one name, not because truth is impossible, but because people truly inhabit different meanings at the same location. Jerusalem teaches the limits of a single story. The city was Canaanite before it was Israelite. It was Israelite and Judean before it was Roman. It was Roman before it became a Christian imperial center. It was Christian before the Islamic conquest, Islamic before the Crusaders, Crusader before Saladin, Mamluk before Ottoman, Ottoman before British, British before divided, and divided before Israeli control over the whole city. No period cancels the others. Later construction does not make earlier history false. Earlier history does not make later lives unreal. This seems obvious from a distance. In Jerusalem, it is revolutionary. The city repeatedly tempts people to choose one layer and call it the only authentic one. A nationalist may begin with the age that proves an ancestral claim. A religious pilgrim may see everything before a sacred event as preparation and everything after it as decline. A conqueror may restore one monument while dismantling another. But the stones refuse purity. A Roman column is reused in an early Islamic building. A Crusader church preserves Byzantine memory. A Mamluk doorway stands on a street laid out by Romans. Ottoman walls enclose Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sites. Modern houses use ancient blocks whose original purpose is forgotten. Jerusalem is not a stack of separate cities. It is a city made from reuse. That may be why every claim to complete ownership eventually fails. To possess Jerusalem fully one would have to possess every meaning ever placed upon it. No empire has managed that. The Babylonians destroyed the temple, but could not destroy Zion in exile. Rome renamed the city, but could not erase Jerusalem from prayer. Byzantine emperors filled it with churches, but could not end Jewish longing. Muslim rulers created a new sacred landscape, but preserved Christian shrines and inherited the memory of biblical prophets. Crusaders captured the city, but could not hold it. Saladin recovered it, but could not end the crusading dream. Ottomans enclosed it with walls, but could not keep European empires outside. Britain governed it, but could not reconcile the promises it had made. Israel captured the old city, but did not settle the Palestinian claim. Every victory reached the gates. None conquered memory. Imagine now that the gates could open not only into streets, but into time. Enter through Jaffa Gate at dawn. The walls around you belong largely to Suleiman the Magnificent. But the road beneath your feet follows older approaches. Turn toward the citadel called the Tower of David, and even its name reveals the city's talent for confusion. The structure is not a surviving palace of David. Its foundations and towers come from later periods, including Herodian, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Crusader, Mamluk, and Ottoman phases. Yet the name remained because Jerusalem does not demand that legend and masonry match perfectly. It demands that they continue speaking. Walk east through the market streets. Shopkeepers lift shutters. Above them are stone arches shaped by generations who rarely appear in chronicles. A conqueror may take a city in one day. It takes masons, carpenters, cooks, and water carriers to make it live for another century. Turn into the Christian quarter. The Holy Sepulchre appears almost hidden among surrounding buildings. There is no vast open avenue announcing it. The entrance stands within a courtyard reached through busy streets. The greatest Christian shrine on earth is crowded by the city around it. That closeness is appropriate. The story remembered inside is not one of worldly triumph. It is a story of execution, burial, grief, and unexpected hope. Move east again, and the alleys narrow. You follow part of the Via Dolorosa, passing stations marked by Christian tradition. Pilgrims sing. Residents carry groceries around them. A child on the way to school slips through a procession commemorating an event from 2,000 years ago. Jerusalem does not stop daily life for history. Daily life passes through history. Continue toward the Haram al-Sharif. The city opens suddenly into space and sky. The crowded alleys fall away. The Dome of the Rock rises above the broad platform with a geometry that has survived earthquakes, dynasties, restorations, and war. Somewhere beneath or near this platform stood the temples that defined ancient Jerusalem. No modern visitor can see the first temple. Much of the second temple complex was destroyed and reshaped. Yet absence here has physical weight. Below, at the western wall, worshippers face stones supporting the ancient platform. Above, Muslims pray within a sanctuary created in the 1st century of Islam. Between them lies not empty distance, but the whole history of the city compressed into height. One community looks upward. Another guards what stands above. No map can solve that relationship. Leave through a gate toward the Mount of Olives. The Kidron Valley opens below. Graves cover the slopes. Jewish burial grounds reflect the hope of resurrection associated with the city. Christian churches mark traditions of Jesus' final days and ascension. Muslim tombs stand near the eastern wall. Even the dead gather close to Jerusalem. Across the valley, the ridge of the earliest city extends south. The Gihon Spring still flows. Hezekiah's tunnel still carries water through rock. The beginning remains beneath the ending. Water brought the first settlers. Memory brought everyone else. This is the hidden structure of Jerusalem's story. The city was never made powerful by size alone. At many points, it was smaller than rival capitals. Babylon, Rome, Constantinople, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and Istanbul possessed greater populations, richer courts, and larger armies. Yet rulers of those cities sought Jerusalem. Why? Because power normally controls bodies, taxes, roads, and armies. Jerusalem offered the possibility of controlling meaning. A king who held the city could present himself as heir to David, guardian of Christ's tomb, protector of Al-Aqsa, defender of the holy places, or restorer of an ancient people. The city gave conquest a language larger than strategy. That language could inspire courage. It could also excuse cruelty. In 1099, Crusaders killed inhabitants while believing themselves agents of sacred liberation. In later centuries, rulers restricted communities while claiming to preserve order. Modern nationalists on all sides have sometimes treated the city as a symbol so pure that the human beings living there become secondary. Jerusalem's history warns against that temptation. Whenever stones become more important than people, the city approaches disaster. The temple was built for worship, yet rulers used it to display power. The cross symbolized sacrifice, yet crusaders carried it into massacre. Al-Aqsa represents devotion, yet political movements have used fear for its safety to mobilize violence. National memorials preserve genuine loss, yet they can be used to deny the losses of others. Sacred history does not automatically make people merciful. Sometimes it makes certainty more dangerous. But Jerusalem also preserves another tradition, the tradition of restraint. It appears in stories of Umar refusing to turn a church into a mosque. It appears in Saladin accepting surrender rather than repeating the massacre of 1099. It appears in families entrusted with church keys, in agreements that allow rival communities to share sacred buildings, and in residents who continue working together across lines drawn by politics. These moments are less dramatic than conquest. That is why they are easy to forget. A massacre can happen in hours and dominate history for centuries. Coexistence is built through thousands of ordinary days that rarely receive a monument. A Muslim doctor treats a Jewish patient. A Jewish paramedic responds in an Arab neighborhood. An Armenian craftsman repairs an object used by a Christian pilgrim. An Arab merchant learns enough Russian, English, and Hebrew to speak with strangers. Religious leaders negotiate access before a festival. Parents on different sides worry about the same sirens. These acts do not solve sovereignty. They keep the city alive while leaders fail to solve it. Jerusalem is often described as eternal. The word sounds peaceful, but eternity has been heavy here. To be the eternal city means every generation inherits unfinished grief. Jews inherit the destruction of the temples, exile, persecution, and the Holocaust. Palestinians inherit dispossession, occupation, exile, and the loss of homes. Christians inherit divisions within their own sacred places and the fear that ancient communities may disappear. Muslims inherit memories of conquest, crusade, and repeated threats to Al-Aqsa. Each community carries wounds that are not imaginary. The danger begins when one wound is used to prove that another cannot exist. History does not require equal events to recognize shared humanity. The Holocaust and the Nakba are not the same event. The Roman destruction and the Crusader massacre are not interchangeable. Different suffering has different causes, scale, and meaning. But grief does not become false because someone else also grieves. Jerusalem could teach that lesson better than any city on earth. Instead, it has often taught the opposite. The modern struggle asks who owns Jerusalem. History answers with another question. Which Jerusalem? The Bronze Age town around the spring? The city of Davidic memory? Solomon's temple city? Hezekiah's besieged capital? The ruins mourned in Babylon? The second temple city of pilgrims? Herod's monumental Jerusalem? The city of Jesus and the early church? Aelia Capitolina? Constantine's Christian pilgrimage center? The Umayyad city, crowned by the Dome of the Rock? The Crusader capital? Saladin's recovered sanctuary? The Mamluk city of schools and endowments? The Ottoman city behind new walls? The late Ottoman city growing beyond them? The British administrative capital? The divided city of barbed wire? The reunited and still contested city after 1967? All are real. None is complete alone. This does not mean that every political claim is equally supported by law or history. It does not mean facts disappear into competing stories. Evidence matters. Dates matter. Documents, archaeology, property records, and international law matter. But facts become dangerous when selected only to erase. A history beginning with David can forget Canaanites and modern Palestinians. A history beginning with 1967 can forget ancient Jewish connection and centuries of longing. A history focused only on the Crusaders can turn Muslims and Eastern Christians into scenery. A history focused only on great religions can erase people who are secular, mixed, doubtful, or simply trying to live. The complete story of Jerusalem is not one line of inheritance. It is a collision of inheritances. That collision can be heard in the city's silence. At night, After markets close, the old city changes. Footsteps echo farther. Lamps illuminate stones polished by millions of feet. The air cools above the hills. From certain rooftops, the major sacred places appear almost close enough to cover with one hand. The city looks unified from above. Only people draw the boundaries. Yet boundaries are not illusions. They determine security, rights, access, and fear. A beautiful view cannot replace justice. A shared skyline cannot erase unequal power or competing national aspirations. Jerusalem needs more than admiration. It needs memory disciplined by truth. That truth includes the grandeur of Solomon's temple tradition and the uncertainty of what archaeology can prove about the 10th century before the Common Era. It includes Jewish exile and continuous connection. It includes the birth of Christianity in a Jewish Jerusalem under Rome. It includes the Islamic transformation of the sacred platform and more than 1,000 years of Muslim attachment. It includes Crusader violence and Saladin's recovery. It includes Ottoman stability and Ottoman inequality. It includes Zionist refuge and Palestinian dispossession. It includes Israeli security fears and Palestinian life under occupation. The truth is not simple enough for a slogan. That is why slogans are so powerful here. They protect people from complexity. But Jerusalem was built from complexity. Remove it, and the city becomes propaganda. Perhaps this is why the most important relic in Jerusalem is not a crown, sword, or throne. It is a wall. Walls define the city at every age. Canaanite fortifications protected the spring. Judahite walls resisted Assyria. Babylon tore walls down. Nehemiah rebuilt them. Romans breached them. Hadrian reshaped the city within new boundaries. Crusaders climbed walls. Saladin besieged them. Ayyubid rulers dismantled defenses rather than let enemies use them. Suleiman raised the walls that frame the old city today. The 20th century added walls of barbed wire and concrete. Every wall promises safety. Every wall also creates an outside. Jerusalem's sacred traditions dream of a final age when division ends. Jewish prophets imagine peace flowing from Zion. Christian scripture imagines a new Jerusalem without death and mourning. Islamic tradition connects the city with judgment, gathering, and the end of earthly history. All three faiths look toward a Jerusalem transformed beyond violence. Yet the earthly city remains unfinished. That unfinished quality may be the most honest thing about it. Jerusalem has never been the perfect city people imagine. David's capital was contested. Solomon's glory was followed by division. The Second Temple Age ended in revolt and fire. Byzantine splendor fell to invasion. Islamic Jerusalem endured dynastic conflict. Crusader Jerusalem was founded in blood. Ottoman peace was imperfect. British order collapsed. Modern reunification did not create reconciliation. Every golden age contained fear. Every disaster left survivors. The city moves forward not by escaping its contradictions, but by carrying them. Look again at the sunrise from the Mount of Olives. The walls brighten first, then the domes, then rooftops, towers, satellite dishes, cemeteries, roads, and neighborhoods spread across the hills. The ancient city appears within the modern one, smaller than expected. From that distance, Jerusalem does not look large enough to hold the hopes placed upon it. Perhaps no city could. Yet for more than 3,000 years, humanity has poured into these hills its deepest questions. Where does God dwell? Who belongs to the land? Can exile end? Can death be defeated? Can conquest be righteous? Can memory survive destruction? Can enemies share what neither can abandon? Jerusalem has answered some of these questions with temples, churches, mosques, laws, and walls. It has answered others with silence. The city has seen kings who believed their names would last forever. Most are remembered only because Jerusalem appears in their story. Abdi-Heba begged Egypt for help. David made the city a capital in biblical tradition. Solomon tied kingship to the temple. Hezekiah cut through rock to bring water inside the walls. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city and created an exile that strengthened its memory. Cyrus allowed return. Antiochus provoked revolt. Pompey entered the sanctuary. Herod built in stone on a scale meant to defeat time. Titus burned the temple. Hadrian changed the name. Constantine raised the Holy Sepulchre. Umar became the model of a restrained conqueror in Islamic memory. Abd al-Malik crowned the platform with gold. The Crusaders took Jerusalem in blood. Saladin took it through negotiated surrender. Suleiman enclosed it in walls. Allenby entered on foot. Modern armies divided and reunited it. All believed they had changed Jerusalem. Jerusalem changed the meaning of them. This is why the city cannot be understood only through who won each war. Victories passed. The deeper question is what remained after victory. After Babylon, the idea of return remained. After Rome, prayer remained. After Byzantium, churches remained. After the Muslim conquest, Christian and Jewish memories remained. After the Crusaders, Islam remained. After Saladin, Christian pilgrimage remained. After the Ottomans, their walls remained. After Britain, the conflict it failed to resolve remained. After every army, civilians remained to bury the dead, repair roofs, reopen shops, and teach children the names of streets. Jerusalem's true conquerors were never those who entered first. They were those who stayed after the banners left. The mason fitting a new stone into a burned house. The scribe copying a text in exile. The mother teaching a prayer toward a city her child had never seen. The keeper unlocking a church before sunrise. The worshiper folding a note and placing it into a wall. The family crossing a checkpoint to reach a hospital. The baker lighting an oven while the streets are still dark. Empires write dates. People create duration. And so Jerusalem endures, not because it escaped destruction, but because destruction never became the final chapter. The city was burned. It returned. Its temple was destroyed. Its memory traveled. Its name was changed. Its old name survived. Its walls were broken. New walls rose. Its people were scattered. Others arrived. Its streets were divided. They were opened and divided again in different ways. Jerusalem survives through unfinished endings. Perhaps that is the reason so many people believe the city belongs to eternity. Not because it never changes, but because no change has ever been able to finish it. One day, another generation will walk these same stones. They will inherit monuments built by people who expected the future to agree with them. They will inherit grievances sharpened by repetition. They will inherit sacred places too important to abandon and too dangerous to possess alone. They will also inherit a choice. They can use history as a weapon, selecting only the memories that justify domination. Or they can use history as a warning. Jerusalem has already shown what happens when certainty becomes more sacred than life. It has also shown that shared space, however fragile, is possible when restraint becomes a form of courage. The city does not need anyone to forget. It needs people to remember more. To remember the temple and the mosque, the cross and the crescent, the exile and the refugee, the ancient kingdom and the living neighborhood, the victory and its cost, the prayer and the person praying beside it in a different language. History remembers Jerusalem as the prize at the end of the road. But the complete story reveals something far more unsettling. Jerusalem was never the prize. It was the test. A test of whether faith could exist without conquest. Whether memory could survive without becoming revenge. Whether a people could love a city without denying that others loved it too. Kings failed that test. Empires failed it. Generations are still taking it. And as the first light spreads across the stones, Jerusalem waits. Not for another conqueror, but for someone to finally understand what every conqueror learned too late. The city cannot be owned by defeating everyone else. It can only be kept alive by leaving room for those who remember it differently. Was Jerusalem destined to become the world's most contested city, or did human ambition turn holiness into a battlefield?